Welcome to Echoes of History, the podcast where we delve deep into the lives and times of figures who shaped our world. Today, we're tackling a titan of American history, a man whose image is as iconic as his story is complex. John F. Kennedy. He served just over 1,000 days in office, a blink in the grand scheme of presidential terms. Yet in that brief period, he became a symbol, a beacon of youth and change, and a figure whose legacy continues to spark debate and fascination more than 60 years after his untimely death. When we think of JFK, what often comes to mind is the youthful vigor, the eloquent speeches, the promise of a new frontier. But peel back the layers, and you find a story far richer, more nuanced, and at times contradictory than the polished public image. His presidency coincided with some of the most perilous moments of the Cold War, the nascent stages of the civil rights movement, and the dramatic beginning of the space race. To truly understand Kennedy, we have to look beyond the myth and into the man himself. A man shaped by immense wealth and ambition, tempered by chronic illness and the crucible of war, and ultimately transformed into an enduring symbol whose life was tragically cut short. It's fascinating how dramatically his historical reputation has swung. Immediately after his death, he was almost universally revered, his presidency seen as this shining, unfinished moment of national promise, a Camelot that was abruptly lost. But as the decades have passed, and more archival records, private tapes, and personal testimonies have emerged, historians have painted a much more complicated portrait. We now see real achievement alongside real caution, genuine idealism alongside calculated political maneuvering, and a private life that was often quite at odds with the public persona so carefully constructed around him. So today, we're going to trace that arc, from his privileged Massachusetts childhood, through his wartime heroism, his rapid rise in politics, his consequential and often perilous presidency, and the sudden, violent end that cemented his place in the American imagination. Let's start at the beginning, his family and childhood. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second of 9 children born to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, this wasn't just any family. This was a family steeped in Irish Catholic political tradition in Boston. Both of his grandfathers were prominent figures. His maternal grandfather, John F. "Honey" Fitzgerald, had been the mayor of Boston, and his paternal grandfather, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, was a ward boss and state legislator. This lineage firmly placed the Kennedys within the Irish Catholic political establishment of Massachusetts, a background that was both a wellspring of ambition and a source of obstacles in a country still grappling with anti-Catholic prejudice. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was a force of nature. He was a formidable and often controversial figure, a banker, a film industry executive, and eventually the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He wasn't just building wealth, he was building a political dynasty. He amassed a huge fortune through banking, film production, and shrewd investments, and he devoted himself to cultivating political power for his family. He even served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom during those tense years leading up to World War II. Rose Kennedy, his mother, was equally impactful in her own way, deeply devout, highly organized, and she managed their large household with rigorous discipline, famously keeping index cards on each child's health and development. Imagine that level of meticulous record-keeping for 9 children. The Kennedy children grew up in a household that practically breathed competition, physical vigor, and intellectual achievement. Family meals weren't quiet affairs. They were often lively debates about current events, with Joseph Sr. pressing his children to defend their opinions. Athletics were central. Sailing, touch football at their famous Hyannisport compound on Cape Cod, which became a symbol of their family identity. Joseph Sr. reportedly told his sons there was no room in the family for anything but success. This philosophy, while instilling a powerful sense of purpose, also created immense pressure, especially on the 2 eldest sons, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. and John, who was known as Jack. Now, Jack's early life was marked by frequent illness. As a toddler, he contracted scarlet fever, a life-threatening illness at the time. And throughout his childhood and adolescence, he was plagued by a series of ailments that would continue to trouble him for the rest of his life, including chronic digestive problems and severe back trouble. This stood in stark contrast to his elder brother, Joe Jr., who was robust, athletic, and widely considered the one destined for political greatness. Jack, by comparison, was seen as more bookish, sickly, and somewhat overshadowed. This dynamic, this shadow cast by his older brother, would persist until Joe Jr.'s tragic death in World War II, which fundamentally reoriented the family's political ambitions directly toward Jack. Despite, or perhaps because of, his frequent illnesses, Jack became a voracious reader from an early age. He was particularly drawn to stories of history, adventure, and heroism, tales of knights, historical battles, figures like Napoleon and Marlborough. These captured his imagination during long stretches of convalescence. His mother recalled that these hospital stays, though frightening, gave him unusual amounts of solitary time that he filled with books. This habit stayed with him throughout his life. Visitors to the White House would later remark on his ability to read extraordinarily quickly and retain what he had read. So, while the household emphasized athletic competition, it also deeply valued current events and public affairs. The children were expected to be knowledgeable about the news and to discuss it intelligently at the dinner table, a practice that instilled in Jack an early familiarity with political and international subjects that would serve him incredibly well later on. The family's immense wealth certainly insulated the children from the economic hardships of the Great Depression, but it didn't insulate them from the anti-Catholic and anti-Irish prejudice that still existed among certain segments of the American Protestant establishment. Even within the wealthy social circles the Kennedys aspired to enter in the Northeast. This experience of being simultaneously privileged and in certain elite circles socially excluded is often cited by biographers as a formative influence on the family's fierce, almost defensive, drive toward political and social achievement. It's like having all the external markers of success, but still feeling like an outsider in some fundamental way, which can fuel an incredible drive to prove oneself. Kennedy's early education saw him attend the Riverdale Country School in New York and Canterbury School in Connecticut, before enrolling at Choate, an elite preparatory school. At Choate, he was an indifferent student for much of his time, more interested in socializing and mischief. He was part of a group who called themselves the Muckers, a designation that referred to their disruptive behavior and nearly got him expelled. Despite this, he graduated in 1935, and a school assessment predicted he was likely to succeed in later life, even as it noted a certain immaturity. It's a fascinating glimpse into the early signs of a charismatic but not always conventionally disciplined young man. After a brief and unsatisfying stint at the London School of Economics, cut short by illness, Kennedy enrolled at Princeton University in the fall of 1935, following a family tradition. However, health problems likely related to a colitis-like condition forced him to withdraw after a short time. He spent months recovering, and the following year, in 1936, he entered Harvard University, his father's alma mater. At Harvard, his academic performance improved considerably, though he still engaged more with sports, swimming and touch football, and an active social life, than with rigorous scholarship, at least initially. He suffered a back injury playing football that would trouble him for the rest of his life, a chronic condition later compounded by wartime injury, and leading to numerous surgeries. This constant physical struggle, often hidden, is a crucial part of understanding the man behind the public image of robust health. During his father's tenure as ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1938 to 1940, Kennedy traveled extensively through Europe. This was a pivotal experience, exposing him directly to the gathering storm of fascism and the diplomatic failures that preceded World War II. He used this first-hand exposure, combined with considerable research, to write his senior thesis at Harvard. It examined why Britain had been so unprepared to counter German rearmament in the 1930s. With editorial help from journalists and family connections. That thesis was published in 1940 as a book titled Why England Slept, drawing its title from Winston Churchill's own work on the same period. The book sold well, aided in part by his father's promotional efforts, and gave the 23-year-old Kennedy his first taste of public recognition as a serious commentator on world affairs. This was a significant step, marking a shift from the mucker at Choate to a burgeoning intellectual. Kennedy graduated from Harvard in 1940 with a degree in international affairs, cum laude. He then briefly attended Stanford's business school before touring South America. His path toward a conventional career, perhaps in law, business, or journalism, was, like so much else in American life, upended by the outbreak of the Second World War. It's important to note that his academic trajectory, while ultimately successful, was neither effortless nor predetermined. Teachers and family friends often described him as charming and quick-witted, but not conspicuously disciplined. It was really only in his final years at Harvard, spurred by his European travels and his father's diplomatic posting, that he began to display the more serious, studious inclination that would produce Why England Slept. Biographers often contrast this later blooming intellectual seriousness with the more overtly academic and disciplined comportment of his younger brother Robert. This suggests that Jack's particular blend of charisma, curiosity, and occasional carelessness set a pattern that would recur throughout his subsequent public life. He was someone who could be brilliant and incisive, but perhaps not always in the most conventional, grinded-out way. Then came the war. Kennedy attempted to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1941, but was rejected because of his chronic back problems. But through his father's connections, he was able to gain a commission in the U.S. Navy later that year. After training, he was assigned to intelligence duties, but he sought and received a combat assignment, eventually taking command of a patrol torpedo or PT boat in the Pacific Theater. This is where the legend of PT-109 begins. Kennedy commanded PT-109, a small, fast wooden vessel used for nighttime attacks on Japanese shipping in the Solomon Islands. On the night of August 1st to 2nd, 1943, PT-109 was patrolling in the Blackett Strait when it was struck and sliced in half by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. 2 crew members were killed instantly in the collision. Kennedy, along with the surviving crew, clung to the wreckage before swimming several miles to a small island. This ordeal was made even more difficult by Kennedy's already troubled back. He famously towed a badly burned crewman, Patrick McMahon, by gripping a strap of McMahon's life jacket in his teeth as he swam. Imagine the sheer grit and determination needed for that. Over the following days, Kennedy and his men moved between small islands, surviving on coconuts. Kennedy made repeated swims into the strait at night, hoping to flag down a passing PT boat, but without success. Eventually, in a truly remarkable act of ingenuity, Kennedy carved a message into a coconut shell and gave it to 2 local Solomon Island scouts, Biyuku Gasa and Arani Kumana. They carried it through Japanese-controlled waters to relay word to Allied forces of the crew's location. This message led to the rescue of Kennedy and his surviving crew after 6 harrowing days stranded. Kennedy was later awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his leadership and courage during the crisis. The story became a foundational element of his public image, that of a genuine war hero, a stark contrast to the often sanitized campaign biographies of many of his contemporaries. He even kept that coconut shell, encased in plastic, on his desk in the Oval Office throughout his presidency, a tangible reminder of his heroism and a powerful symbol for visitors. But while it was a heroic moment, the physical toll of the PT-109 incident, layered atop his pre-existing back problems, would plague Kennedy for the rest of his life. It necessitated a dangerous spinal surgery in 1944 and further operations later on. He was eventually discharged from the Navy in early 1945. Then came another pivotal moment, a truly devastating one for the family: the death of Joseph Jr. In August 1944, Kennedy's older brother, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., a Navy pilot, was killed when the explosives-laden aircraft he was piloting on a hazardous volunteer mission over England exploded prematurely. Had been the family's presumed political standard-bearer, the son their father had groomed most explicitly for high office, potentially even the presidency. His death devastated the family, and according to numerous accounts, effectively transferred the weight of political ambition onto Jack's shoulders. It was a role he had not sought for himself, but one he increasingly came to accept as a kind of family obligation, a duty to fulfill his brother's destiny. After the war, Kennedy briefly worked as a journalist, covering the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco and the British general election of 1945 for Hearst newspapers. This experience gave him further exposure to international affairs and journalism, but it wasn't to be his long-term path. Encouraged, and to a significant degree orchestrated, by his father, Kennedy decided to run for elected office. In 1946, Kennedy ran for the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District, an area that included working-class neighborhoods of Boston and Cambridge. On paper, he was an unlikely fit, wealthy, Harvard-educated, and somewhat reserved in manner. But he campaigned energetically, drawing on his status as a decorated war veteran and on his family's considerable financial resources and organizational muscle. He won the Democratic primary and went on to win the general election easily in the heavily Democratic district. Kennedy served 3 terms in the House, from 1947 to 1953. His voting record was generally in line with mainstream liberal Democratic positions, particularly on housing and labor issues important to his working-class constituents. However, he was less prominent nationally during this period and was sometimes viewed as more focused on personal advancement than on legislative craftsmanship. Colleagues in the House later recalled him as an inconsistent attendee, more interested in ideas and travel than in the grinding committee work that built reputations among the chamber's most respected members. His ambitions from early on seemed to point past the House towards statewide or even national office. His health problems persisted. In 1947, he was diagnosed with Addison's disease, a disorder of the adrenal glands, which was kept largely secret from the public for the remainder of his political career. Revealing a chronic illness would likely have damaged his political prospects. He also began a long course of treatments for his back, undergoing significant back surgery in 1954 and again in 1955. Procedures so serious that he was administered last rites at least once during his recovery. This constant battle with severe, often life-threatening health issues while maintaining a public image of vitality is one of the most striking paradoxes of his life. Throughout these years, Kennedy also traveled internationally, including trips to the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. These journeys further deepened his interest in foreign policy and gave him direct exposure to the early stages of decolonization movements that were reshaping large parts of the globe. He became an early and somewhat unusual voice within his own party for a more skeptical view of French colonial efforts in Indochina. In a 1951 speech, he argued that the United States should be cautious about tying itself to a losing colonial struggle. This position is particularly notable in hindsight, given the trajectory of American involvement in Vietnam in the following decade. It shows a certain prescience, or at least a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, that would become a hallmark of his later foreign policy thinking. In 1952, Kennedy made a significant move, challenging the incumbent Republican senator from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., a member of one of the state's most prominent political families. It was a closely watched race, run in a year when Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican, carried Massachusetts at the top of the ticket. Kennedy nonetheless won the Senate seat, aided by an extensive, well-funded campaign organization substantially built and run by his younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, along with his mother and sisters, who conducted a distinctive series of political teas to reach female voters directly. This was a family effort through and through, showcasing the Kennedy machine at its best. The following year, in September 1953, Kennedy married Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, a young, cultured Washington-based photographer from a socially prominent family. Their lavish wedding in Newport, Rhode Island, drew national press attention. Jacqueline Kennedy would go on to become one of the most visible and stylish first ladies in American history, and the couple's glamour became an important element of the Kennedy political brand. This public image of a glamorous, ideal couple, however, privately masked strains in their marriage, including Kennedy's infidelities, a subject not widely reported during his lifetime due to the journalistic norms of the era. During his convalescence from those serious back surgeries in 1954 and 1955, Kennedy, with substantial assistance from his aide and speechwriter Theodore Sorensen, worked on a book called Profiles in Courage. The book told the stories of 8 U.S. senators throughout history who had taken politically risky stands on principle. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1957, a considerable boost to Kennedy's reputation as a serious intellectual figure, though it later became a subject of controversy amid questions about the extent of Sorensen's contribution to the writing. Regardless of the exact authorship, the book cemented his image as a thoughtful leader. Kennedy's national profile rose further in 1956 when he narrowly missed being selected as the Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson's running mate. Stevenson took the unusual step of leaving the vice presidential selection to the convention delegates, and Kennedy lost a close multi-ballot contest to Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Although a defeat, the near miss significantly raised Kennedy's national visibility and positioned him perfectly for the next presidential cycle. In 1958, he was re-elected to the Senate by a wide margin, further cementing his position as a leading contender for the 1960 Democratic presidential nomination. The stage was set. Kennedy formally announced his candidacy for the presidency in January 1960. He faced a competitive field for the Democratic nomination, including Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, and others. Kennedy's Catholicism was widely regarded as a potential liability. No Catholic had ever been elected president, and there was a lingering concern, rooted in the failed 1928 candidacy of Al Smith, that a Catholic president would be unduly influenced by the Vatican. Kennedy confronted this issue directly in a notable speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association in September 1960. In it, he argued forcefully for a strict separation of church and state, and insisted that his religious beliefs were a private matter that would not dictate his conduct as president. This was a masterclass in political courage and strategic communication, directly addressing a deeply ingrained prejudice. Kennedy secured the Democratic nomination at the party's convention in Los Angeles in July 1960. In a move that surprised many observers, given their sometimes tense relationship, he selected Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. This choice was widely seen as a shrewd strategy to shore up support in the South and among more conservative Democrats, balancing the ticket geographically and ideologically. The general election against Republican nominee Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, was exceptionally close and is remembered as a landmark moment in American political communication because of the first-ever televised presidential debates. The initial debate, in September 1960, is often cited as a turning point. Those who listened on radio reportedly judged the debate roughly even or even favored Nixon. However, television viewers were widely thought to have favored the youthful, tanned, and composed Kennedy over a Nixon who appeared pale, underweight after a recent hospitalization, and visibly uncomfortable on camera. Whatever the debate's precise electoral impact, it marked a fundamental shift in American politics toward the visual medium of television as a decisive factor in national campaigns. It was the moment image began to truly matter as much as, if not more than, substance for a wide swath of the electorate. The election, held in November 1960, was one of the closest in American history. Kennedy won the popular vote by a margin of roughly 0.1%, a razor-thin victory. The outcome in the Electoral College, while more decisive, depended on extremely narrow results in several states, including Illinois, where allegations of voting irregularities in Chicago prompted calls for a recount that Nixon ultimately declined to pursue. At 43, Kennedy became the youngest man ever elected president, and along with being the second youngest to hold the office, after Theodore Roosevelt, who became president through succession rather than election, he became the first Roman Catholic president in American history. It was a momentous achievement, breaking barriers and signaling a generational shift. Kennedy was inaugurated on January 20th, 1961, delivering an inaugural address remembered for its soaring rhetoric, its call to civic sacrifice, and its Cold War framing of American purpose. The speech's most famous line, of course, called on citizens to consider what they could do for their country rather than what their country could do for them. It also pledged American support to allies around the world in the defense of liberty. The address, delivered on a bitterly cold day, is widely regarded as one of the most eloquent in presidential history. It helped establish the tone of vigor and idealism that would characterize the Kennedy administration's self-presentation, often described using the term Camelot, a label that gained currency only after Kennedy's death, drawn from a musical that Jacqueline Kennedy referenced in an interview shortly after the assassination. This idea of a golden age, a fleeting moment of grace and idealism, really took root. Kennedy assembled a cabinet and staff often described as the best and the brightest, featuring accomplished figures such as Robert McNamara, a former Ford Motor Company executive, as Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk as Secretary of State. Notably, Kennedy appointed his younger brother Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, a decision that drew criticism as nepotism, but that also reflected the close, trusted working relationship between the two brothers that would shape decision-making throughout the administration, particularly during moments of crisis. Bobby Kennedy became one of his brother's most vital and trusted advisors, a true partner in governance. One of the earliest and most consequential episodes of Kennedy's presidency was the failed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. This operation, planned during the Eisenhower administration and inherited by Kennedy, involved a covert CIA-backed force of Cuban exiles attempting to land on the island's southern coast and spark a popular uprising against the government of Fidel Castro. The invasion collapsed within days as the exile forces quickly overwhelmed by Cuban military forces. Kennedy made the crucial decision not to provide the direct American air support that might have salvaged the operation. Military involvement would be internationally and diplomatically disastrous. The episode was a significant early embarrassment for the new administration, a harsh lesson in the complexities of covert operations and foreign policy. But Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility for the failure, a response that somewhat paradoxically helped shore up his public standing, even as it damaged American prestige abroad and hardened Cold War tensions with Cuba and the Soviet Union. It showed a willingness to own mistakes, which resonated with the public. Tensions with the Soviet Union deepened over Berlin later in 1961. The East German government, with Soviet backing, began construction of the Berlin Wall in August of that year to stem the flow of refugees from East to West Berlin. The crisis had been building for months, ever since a tense summit meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in June 1961. At that meeting, the Soviet leader reportedly took a hard, testing line with the young American president, an encounter that some historians believe left Khrushchev with an impression of Kennedy as inexperienced, an impression that may have emboldened Soviet actions in both Berlin and, later, Cuba. Kennedy responded to the Berlin Wall's construction with a firm but measured diplomatic posture, reinforcing the American military presence in West Berlin, and dispatching Vice President Johnson and General Lucius Clay to the city as a show of resolve. But he avoided direct confrontation over the wall's construction itself, judging that the wall, however morally repugnant, was preferable to a wider war, and in a narrow strategic sense, even reduced the risk of a sudden crisis over Berlin by stabilizing the flow of refugees that had so alarmed East German authorities. It was a pragmatic, if difficult, decision. He later visited West Berlin in June 1963, delivering a speech in which he expressed solidarity with the city's residents in their defiance of Soviet-backed division, famously declaring his identification with their cause in a phrase that became instantly famous, "Ich bin ein Berliner." This moment became one of the signature rhetorical events of his presidency and one of the largest, most enthusiastic crowds he ever addressed, showcasing his ability to connect with people on a deeply emotional level. But the defining crisis of Kennedy's presidency, and arguably one of the most dangerous episodes of the entire Cold War, occurred in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. American reconnaissance flights discovered that the Soviet Union was constructing sites in Cuba capable of launching nuclear-armed medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, weapons that could strike much of the continental United States within minutes of launch. This was an existential threat, a game-changer. Kennedy convened a small, trusted group of advisors, later known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to deliberate on a response. The group debated a terrifying range of options, from diplomatic protest to airstrikes against the missile sites to a full invasion of Cuba. Several of these options carried a substantial risk of direct military conflict with the Soviet Union, and given the nuclear stakes involved, the terrifying possibility of escalation to nuclear war. It was like a game of nuclear chess, where one wrong move could mean global catastrophe. Kennedy ultimately chose a middle course, a naval quarantine around Cuba to prevent further Soviet military shipments. He deliberately used the term quarantine rather than blockade, because a blockade is technically an act of war under international law, a subtle but crucial diplomatic distinction. This was combined with a demand that the Soviet Union remove the missiles already in place, while simultaneously pursuing diplomatic channels to defuse the standoff. For 13 tense days, the crisis played out amid fears that the confrontation could spiral into nuclear conflict. Soviet ships approached the American naval quarantine line, and both sides took military precautions, including elevated alert postures for U.S. strategic forces. The world held its breath. The crisis was ultimately resolved through a combination of public and secret diplomacy. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade the island. Crucially, there was also a secret, separate agreement that the United States would later withdraw its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession not disclosed publicly at the time to avoid appearing weak or making concessions under duress. The peaceful resolution of the crisis was widely regarded, both at the time and since, as a triumph of careful, restrained crisis management, and it significantly boosted Kennedy's domestic and international standing. In the aftermath, both governments took steps toward reducing the risk of future crises, including the establishment of a direct communications link, sometimes called the hotline, between Washington and Moscow, and the negotiation of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. This was a moment where the world truly stared down the barrel of nuclear war and pulled back, thanks in large part to Kennedy's measured leadership. Beyond the Cold War, Kennedy's relationship with the civil rights movement evolved significantly over the course of his presidency. He moved from initial caution, driven by a desire to preserve working relationships with Southern Democrats in Congress, whose support he needed for other legislative priorities, toward more direct engagement as the movement's momentum and the moral urgency of the issue became increasingly difficult to sidestep. It was a journey from political pragmatism to moral conviction. Early in his term, Kennedy's administration responded to specific crises as they arose, rather than immediately pursuing comprehensive civil rights legislation. In 1961, the administration provided federal protection for the Freedom Riders, activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated South to challenge continued segregation in violation of federal law, after they faced violent attacks from mobs in Alabama. This was a direct intervention against brutal violence. In 1962, Kennedy ordered federal marshals and ultimately federalized National Guard and Army troops to enforce the enrollment of James Meredith, a black student at the University of Mississippi, after the university's attempts to bar Meredith's admission led to violent riots on campus. A similar confrontation occurred in June 1963 at the University of Alabama, when Governor George Wallace staged a symbolic stand in the schoolhouse door to protest the enrollment of black students, an obstruction that Kennedy again countered by federalizing the Alabama National Guard. In each case, federal power was used to enforce desegregation in the face of state resistance. That same evening in June 1963, Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address on civil rights, describing the issue in explicitly moral terms and announcing his intention to send comprehensive civil rights legislation to Congress. This was a crucial turning point, a moral call to action that laid the groundwork for future legislation. Tragically, just hours after Kennedy's address, Mississippi NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was assassinated outside his home in Jackson, Mississippi, a stark illustration of the violence that continued to accompany the struggle for civil rights in the South, underscoring the urgency of Kennedy's plea. In August 1963, Kennedy's administration monitored closely and ultimately gave tacit support to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, at which Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his renowned "I Have a Dream" speech. Kennedy met with march leaders at the White House afterward. Nonetheless, his civil rights bill remained stalled in Congress at the time of his death, a testament to the deep-seated resistance it faced. Its eventual passage the following year owed a great deal to the parliamentary skill and political capital of his successor, Lyndon Johnson, along with the wave of national sentiment that followed Kennedy's assassination. So while he initiated the push, the final victory came after his time. Kennedy's presidency also coincided with an intensifying space race with the Soviet Union, a competition that took on heightened symbolic importance in the broader Cold War contest. It was a battle over which political and economic system could demonstrate superior technological and scientific achievement. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 had already shocked America, but more directly relevant to Kennedy's presidency was the Soviet Union's success in putting the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit in April 1961. This was a major blow to American prestige and spurred the new administration to seek a dramatic response. In May 1961, shortly after Gagarin's flight and the Bay of Pigs failure, Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress and set an incredibly ambitious national goal: landing an American astronaut on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. He reiterated and elaborated on this commitment in a notable speech at Rice University in September 1962, in which he framed the lunar landing goal as a challenge the nation should embrace precisely because it was difficult, not because it was easy. He understood the power of a grand, unifying national project. The Apollo program that emerged from this commitment required enormous federal investment and organizational effort. It would ultimately achieve its goal in July 1969, when Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface, an achievement Kennedy did not live to see, but one that stands as one of the most concrete and inspiring legacies of his presidency. It showed the world what America could achieve when it set its mind to it. Then there's Vietnam. Kennedy inherited a small but growing American commitment to South Vietnam from the Eisenhower administration, part of the broader Cold War strategy of containing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. During his presidency, the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam increased substantially, from several hundred to over 16,000 by the time of his death, alongside increased economic and military aid to the government of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. By 1963, the Diem government faced increasing domestic opposition, including from Buddhist monks protesting religious discrimination, and the Kennedy administration grew increasingly disillusioned with GM's leadership. In November 1963, just weeks before Kennedy's own death, GM was overthrown and killed in a coup carried out by South Vietnamese generals. The Kennedy administration had been aware of this coup in advance and had signaled it would not actively oppose it, though the extent of direct American involvement in encouraging the coup remains a subject of intense historical debate. The question of what path Kennedy would have pursued in Vietnam had he lived, whether toward continued gradual escalation, withdrawal, or some other course, remains one of the most contested counterfactual debates in American political history. There's substantial disagreement among historians and former aides about his likely intentions. Some believe he was planning a withdrawal after the 1964 election, while others argue he was committed to containing communism and would have continued the buildup. It's a question that, tragically, can never be definitively answered, adding another layer of what if to his legacy. On the domestic front, Kennedy's agenda, sometimes referred to as the New Frontier, included proposals for expanded federal aid to education, a program of health insurance for the elderly, a precursor to what would become Medicare under Johnson, and various measures aimed at economic growth and reducing unemployment. Many of these initiatives faced resistance in a Congress where conservative Southern Democrats often aligned with Republicans to block liberal legislative priorities. Much of Kennedy's domestic program, therefore, remained unfinished or unpassed at the time of his death, later to be substantially enacted under Johnson's Great Society initiatives. So, while his vision was ambitious, the legislative reality of his time in office was often one of stalemate. Kennedy did achieve some notable economic successes, including a significant tax cut proposal aimed at stimulating economic growth, which, though passed only after his death, reflected his administration's embrace of Keynesian economic ideas about the government's role in managing the business cycle. This was a modern approach to economic policy. He also created the Peace Corps by executive order in early 1961, an initiative that sent young American volunteers abroad to assist with development projects in poorer countries. This became one of the most enduring and popularly admired achievements of his presidency, embodying the idealistic, service-oriented rhetoric of his inaugural address. The Peace Corps remains a powerful symbol of American idealism and global engagement. Now, let's touch on the personal life and health that so profoundly shaped him. Kennedy's public image as a vigorous athletic leader belied the serious and chronic health problems that afflicted him throughout his life, and were largely concealed from the public during his political career. In addition to his Addison's disease and his severe back problems, which caused him significant daily pain and required him to wear a back brace, he was known to take a wide range of medications. Questions about the medical management of his conditions and its potential effects on his judgment and functioning have been the subject of historical inquiry after his death, as more medical records became available. It's truly remarkable how effectively he kept these debilitating conditions hidden from public view, a testament to his determination and the protective bubble around him. His marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy produced 4 children. Their daughter Caroline was born in 1957, and their son, John F. Kennedy Jr., was born shortly after the 1960 election, instantly becoming a public darling. A third child, Patrick, was born prematurely in August 1963 and died just 2 days after birth, a deeply personal tragedy that occurred only months before Kennedy's own death, and that reportedly brought the couple emotionally closer together in the final period of his life. An earlier pregnancy in 1956 had also ended in stillbirth. These personal losses are a poignant counterpoint to the public glamour. Kennedy's personal conduct, including numerous extramarital relationships, was known to some journalists and government officials during his lifetime, but was generally not reported by a press corps that at the time largely observed an unwritten code of discretion regarding the private lives of public officials. This norm would erode substantially in subsequent decades. detailed public knowledge of these aspects of his life emerged more fully in the years and decades following his death, adding another layer to the complex portrait historians have painted. And then, the day that changed everything. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy traveled to Dallas, Texas, as part of a political trip intended in part to shore up Democratic Party unity in the state ahead of the 1964 election. Riding in an open-top presidential limousine in a motorcade for downtown Dallas, alongside Texas Governor John Connally and their wives, Kennedy was shot at approximately 12:30 p.m. local time as the motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza. He was struck by gunfire and was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead a short time later. He was 46 years old. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former U.S. Marine with a history of political radicalism, including a period of residence in the Soviet Union, was arrested later that day and charged with the assassination, as well as with the killing of a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippit. 2 days later, on November 24th, while being transferred between jail facilities, Oswald was himself shot and killed by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby, an act broadcast live on national television. This event added to the extraordinary and traumatic nature of the 4 days following the assassination, and has fueled decades of speculation and conspiracy theories regarding the full circumstances of Kennedy's death. The live television murder of an assassin was unprecedented and deeply shocking. President Johnson, who was sworn in aboard Air Force One in Dallas hours after the shooting, established a commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren and known as the Warren Commission, to investigate the assassination. The commission concluded in 1964 that Oswald had acted alone in killing Kennedy, a finding that has been challenged and debated extensively in the decades since by researchers, journalists, and a portion of the public who have proposed alternative theories involving broader conspiracies, though no conspiracy theory has achieved anything resembling scholarly consensus or definitive alternative proof. A later congressional investigation in the late 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, controversially concluded there was a probable conspiracy, a finding based substantially on acoustic evidence that was later disputed by further scientific analysis, leaving the question a subject of ongoing public fascination and historical uncertainty even today. The echoes of that day and the questions it raised continue to reverberate. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where an eternal flame, lit by Jacqueline Kennedy at the funeral, continues to mark his grave. The nation's response to his death was one of profound and widely shared grief, with millions watching televised coverage of the funeral proceedings over the following days, an event that some historians regard as a formative collective experience for the generation that witnessed it. It was a moment of national trauma, a shared experience of loss that unified a deeply divided country, if only for a brief time. Kennedy's presidency, though brief, left a substantial and complex legacy. He is remembered for his role in steering the country through the Cuban Missile Crisis without resorting to war, for launching the Apollo program that would put Americans on the moon, for establishing the Peace Corps, and for beginning to move the federal government toward a more assertive role in support of civil rights. Even though the most consequential civil rights legislation of the era was passed after his death, his eloquence and personal charisma, amplified by the still new medium of television, helped establish a modern template for presidential communication and public image that subsequent politicians of both parties have sought to emulate. He truly understood how to use the emerging media landscape to his advantage. At the same time, historians have offered more critical assessments of aspects of his presidency, including the Bay of Pigs failure, the gradual escalation of American involvement in Vietnam, the incompleteness of his domestic legislative record, and the extent to which his public image was carefully constructed and diverged in various ways from the more complicated realities of his health, his personal conduct, and, in the assessment of some historians, occasionally more cautious or calculating decision-making than the heroic narrative sometimes suggests. The scholarly and popular understanding of Kennedy has thus evolved considerably since his death, moving from an initial period of largely uncritical, even reverential, commemoration, epitomized by the Camelot framing, toward a more nuanced and at times more skeptical historical reassessment that seeks to weigh his genuine accomplishments against the limitations and shortcomings of his time in office. This ongoing process of historical revision is vital to understanding any complex figure. The Kennedy family continued to play a prominent role in American public life after his death. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, served as a U.S. Senator from New York and was himself tragically assassinated during his own 1968 presidential campaign, just 5 years after his brother. His youngest brother, Edward Ted Kennedy, went on to a long career as a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, becoming one of the most influential legislators of the late 20th century. The Kennedy family's combination of public service, personal tragedy, and enduring visibility in American life has led some to refer to a broader pattern, sometimes described informally as the Kennedy curse, reflecting the extraordinary sequence of untimely deaths and misfortunes that has touched multiple generations of the family. It's a stark reminder of the immense pressures and dangers that came with their prominence. More than 60 years after his death, John F. Kennedy remains a figure of enduring fascination, studied not only for the substantive record of his presidency, but for what his life and sudden death reveal about mid-20th century American politics, culture, and the enduring power of image and narrative in shaping how a nation remembers its leaders. His presidency, situated at the intersection of Cold War anxiety, the emerging civil rights revolution, and the dawn of the television age, continues to serve as a touchstone for understanding the possibilities and limitations of American political leadership in a moment of profound national change. Public opinion surveys conducted periodically in the decades since his death have consistently ranked Kennedy among the more highly regarded American presidents in the eyes of the general public. This is often in contrast to professional historians, who weigh legislative accomplishment and administrative record more heavily, and have tended to place him in a more middling position relative to the very top tier of American presidents. This gap between popular sentiment and scholarly assessment is itself instructive. It suggests that Kennedy's enduring appeal rests less on a dispassionate accounting of policy outcomes than on the qualities that made him such a singular presence in American public life. His rhetorical gifts, his personal charisma, the sense of generational renewal his election seemed to promise, and the raw tragedy of a life and a set of unfulfilled possibilities cut short in an instant on a November afternoon in Dallas. Whatever verdict future generations of historians ultimately render on the substance of this presidency, John F. Kennedy's place in the American imagination as a symbol of youthful promise interrupted seems secure. He remains a figure of immense power, a reminder of what might have been, and a compelling study in leadership, charisma, and the indelible mark one individual can leave on history, even in a tragically short time. So, as we wrap up today, let's remember a few key takeaways about JFK. First, his background. Born into immense wealth and a powerful Irish Catholic political dynasty, a family driven by ambition and tempered by prejudice. Second, his personal struggles, chronic, debilitating health issues that he masterfully concealed, and the profound impact of his brother Joe Jr.'s death, which redirected the family's political hopes onto him. Third, his rise to power, a decorated war hero, a shrewd politician who understood the emerging power of television, and a barrier breaker as the first Catholic president. Fourth, his presidency, marked by both triumphs, like the Cuban Missile Crisis resolution, the Peace Corps, and the Moonshot Challenge, and failures, such as the Bay of Pigs and the escalating involvement in Vietnam. Finally, his enduring legacy, the tragic assassination that cemented his mythical status, the ongoing debate about his policy intentions and personal life, and his lasting image as a symbol of youthful idealism cut short. He was a complex man in a complex time, and his story continues to resonate, shaping how we think about leadership, legacy, and the American dream. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of John F. Kennedy. I hope you've gained a deeper, more nuanced understanding of this iconic figure. Join us next time on Echoes of History as we uncover another captivating story from the past.